by Dr. Mark, followed by a closed session. So, Dr. Marco de Jong is a Pacific historian and lecturer at the AUT Law School. He was raised in Tamaki Makarao with ties to Papapulea in Samoa, where he holds the chiefly title Faumuina. His work details the history of regional politics and environmental governance in the Pacific Islands. Prior to joining AUT, Dr. de Jong completed his doctoral degree at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar on the history of SPREP, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. He is currently researching the history of Pacific negotiations towards the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, alongside contemporary research into New Zealand's consideration of involvement in AUKUS Security Pact, as well as the effects of highly networked military technologies on Pacific regional security. So, Dr. de Jong, we look forward to your 20-minute presentation, followed by questions and answers. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sizus Masi.
Half day, elders, excellencies, those in the room watching online, all Pacific greetings to you all. It's a great privilege to speak to you today as part of the Micronesian Security Dialogue. Susumase, Ken, for the introduction. So good to see you. And thank you, Nolan, for your assistance with the slides today. And overall, thank you to PCIS for the invitation and your hosting of this webinar, which is so timely for our region. I'm a great admirer of the work of PCIS. I read Pacific Winds most days. I constantly see media about, with commentary on issues like, basing, missile defense, housing, the recent work on mapping geostrategic competition. Coming from such a small team, it's a real service to the region, and there's nothing like it. The work is well appreciated here in the South. I'm also acutely aware of its purpose in centering the Micronesian and North Pacific perspective, and that my own very much comes from Polynesia in the South, but I hope what I share today feels relevant and connects and complements that perspective without speaking for what you already know so much more deeply. Please, Nolan, could you change the slides? I've been asked to speak today about emerging domains and the implications for regional and international dimensions of Micronesian security. I've also been asked to provide a geopolitical assessment, identify key areas of strategic concern, and reflect on how Micronesian governments and institutions might exercise greater agency. I'll do that with reference to how they have done so in the past through the Noumea Convention, and how that might inform a strategy across two emerging domains that are especially relevant to the region: deep seabed mining and uncrewed maritime systems or sea drones. Please change, Nolan. And here's the outline here. For the past decade, my research is focused on, next one. For the past decade, my research is focused on some of the historic achievements of Pacific regionalism, which did precisely this. And I'm sure many others in the room know them intimately. The Law of the Sea negotiations that secured extended maritime jurisdiction commensurate with any continent, the Treaty of Rarotonga, which established the world's second nuclear-free zone and embedded our Pacific principles of peace, nuclear justice, and expanded security and international law, and the recognition of the special case of small island developing states within the UN system, which enabled climate action through OASIS, and ultimately the crowning achievement of 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. I'm, of course, not the only one to do so and to be so inspired. And of course, they prompted the region's abiding popular geopolitical paradigm that as a sea of islands, we could overturn external estimations of distance and isolation in that age of so-called benign neglect and neoliberal efficiency. And the idea that we are islands in a far sea by harnessing our ocean identity for narrative empowerment as the strong moral voice for global interventions. Today, for small states in a rupturing world order, pulled by the polarizing rivalry of the United States and China to immediate material effect, the need for such continued coordinated regional action is clear. But in discussions with others, especially my collaborator, Siona Tikitiki, we've become increasingly concerned that many of the Pacific's long-standing approaches are now becoming misaligned and ineffectual. Narrative empowerment, the leadership through a strong moral voice, is too easily co-opted or disregarded and relies on the multilateral and international legal system currently under attack. Friends to all, hedging in bilateral relations with larger partners, especially while negotiating security pacts, has arguably not resulted in diplomatic price setting, but rather the feeling of being divided and reconquered in a race to the bottom. In regional fora, Pacific Way consensus politics is increasingly compromised by the internal division of national interests and the external subversion of donor agendas, risking a regionalism of the universal veto and the lowest common denominator. Ultimately, regional governance is struggling to turn narrative and principles into the norms and rules that have protected our small states. Please change, Nolan. Given the brief moment we have today, and by way of provocation, my suggestion is that Pacific regionalism needs a new popular geopolitical paradigm. Like Haofa, this paradigm should pose a new question and prompt a new answer. Like Islands in a Far Sea, it should focus us on material conditions and our geopolitical reality, illuminate our subjecthood, and like our Sea of Islands, it should enable collective agency and self-determination as a legitimate foundation for regional governance. Sione and I reached this conclusion after observing intensifying competition across what we term emerging domains, what we loosely define as those areas of specialized activity that have become strategically, economically, or socially significant with technological development and geopolitical shifts. And you can think of many examples, such as submarine cables, ground-based space infrastructure, access to Antarctica, so on and so forth. The ones that we're describing today: deep sea mining, sea drones. Our belief is that emerging domains have fundamentally changed the strategic relevance of Pacific Islands for major powers and centered the region in new forms of physical or political space, but almost entirely without the input or interests of Pacific people. Because these domains are developing rapidly, are often highly technical and capital intensive, involve private interests and so forth, they risk compounding capacity constraints and deepening dependency. So we are no longer islands in a far sea. That was the structural reality of yesteryear. Indeed, we're now central, but no more in control. Unfortunately, we are seen as islands in chains that remain shackled by colonial status or neo-colonial dependency and hub and spokes, or arranged as a staging ground for war planning, as the lattice fence, or are further crisscrossed by shipping routes, submarine cables, so forth, as supply chains. This material reality, of course, has been long appreciated by Micronesians. But while emerging domains pose a particular challenge for the Pacific region and its existing legal frameworks and models of governance, if the region moves dynamically, emerging domains also present opportunities for new mechanisms capable of leveraging that strategic relevance and establishing preemptive norms to strengthen collective agency and safeguard our sovereignty. Please change, Nolan. This requires a strategy that we're calling mutual reinforcement, provisionally the barrier reef, which involves coordination, sequential or diverse positioning to work the terrain and arrange sovereignty, access, and moral authority at the earliest stage of domain development, while resisting, on the one hand, premature or exclusive arrangements that fragment consent and constrain the region's ability to set rules that govern domains, and on the other hand, kind of unitary or totalizing consensus building process that's liable to be co-opted or bogged down. The key is understanding the leverage, and in this we take example from the Noumea Convention. Please change, Nolan. This is the story of how the recognition of the Pacific environmentalism, of especially the Micronesian nations, by certain metropolitan powers, namely New Zealand, prohibited the regional dumping of nuclear waste and secured a Pacific regime of ocean governance. Next slide, Nolan. Thank you. It centers around this preambular clause highlighted, referencing the special, quote, special hydrological, geological, and ecological characteristics of the region. This is most interesting language and anomalous amongst other United Nations Environmental Programme Regional Seas Conventions, of which Noumea is one. And here's how it came to be there. Please change, Nolan. Now, negotiations towards the Noumea Convention were highly sensitive because when Pacific nations came together, the first thing we wanted to do was ban nuclear testing and dumping. And here's an excerpt from the delegate from Guam, referencing the first State of the Environment report under SPREC, the South Pacific Regional Environment Programme, and spelling out the risks. Of course, that this wasn't amenable to France or the United States or Britain or Japan for that matter, so negotiations stretched over 4 years in a series of expert meetings. For its part, the United States would not cede high sea rights to potentially dump low-level nuclear waste, despite having ceased the practice in 1969. The belief was that low-level nuclear waste dumping was safe, so the US feared jeopardizing its position on global treaties, namely the Law of the Sea and London Dumping Conventions, by establishing a possible precedent wherein stricter standards were set for a particular area of open ocean in the supposed absence of quote-unquote scientific justification, thus potentially leading to similar initiatives elsewhere. Please change. These maps show the different options for the convention area and the location of the high sea pockets at issue. Pacific nations were united in pushing for the largest area possible there on the left, stretching to the north and south of the Pacific Exclusive Economic Zones in a so-called picture frame. Next slide. The accusation was that anti-nuclearism was political and moreover motivated by an anti-colonial desire to create a nuclear-free zone. Listening to Pacific perspectives broadened this viewpoint. Over the course of the first few meetings, Pacific nations simply communicated what the ocean meant to them. For the Northern Marianas, it was the source of health and security they were dramatically dependent on, a place of delicate ecological balance for Kiribati. For Fiji, it was our, quote, one overwhelming and common link, our shared interest. Federated States of Micronesia referenced the work of Sprit here, arguing for a regional environment, a united ocean, and against claims of politicking. As they grew increasingly irate at metropolitan stubbornness, Pacific nations hinted at reprisals. Change twice, please. And once more. Declassified Australian documents pictured on that last slide, containing leaks from the Pentagon and State Department, reveal a significant movement. A growing group of moderates believe that the US, in pressuring Pacific nations not to sign a comprehensive convention, risked having it backfire if Pacific nations were to ban nuclear warship visits. The debate raged at the highest levels for about a year. It was raised consistently at ANZUS meetings as New Zealand and Australia pressured the US to be flexible. So this is the quotes from Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet and then the New Zealand and Australian position at ANZUS where they're saying be flexible. And change twice again, please, Nolan. Declassified documents reveal how Canberra colluded with Washington to prevent substantive anti-nuclearism here, and once more. This had been established in the case of the Treaty of Rarotonga, and my work shows how this impacted Noumea and the issue of waste dumping too. Please change. In the end, as political pressure grew, the US accepted new scientific arguments inspired by the science described above, and that outline the unsuitability of the Pacific Ocean and specifically the high sea pockets of the draft convention area for nuclear waste dumping. My feeling and what inspires the rest of this talk is that this was likely possible because of an alignment of values and interests with leverage, i.e. that a Pacific commitment to protecting an interconnected ocean against nuclear waste dumping, a regional regime of ocean governance, could be enacted by pressuring the question of nuclear warship port visits. Change twice, please. We can, and again, once more, sorry. This is just the Australian position, which brings us to the question of deep sea mining. In this respect, there have been three major shifts with regional implications that are worth reiterating. Please change. First, with the increased emphasis placed on defence critical minerals and supply chain resilience, the strategic relevance of such minerals has overtaken their importance in, say, the green transition, which has implications for the justifications that Pacific sponsoring states have used thus far and makes arguments for moratoria more attractive. Second, with the Trump administration's executive order to unleash offshore critical minerals, suggesting that the United States might potentially circumvent the ISA, Pacific sponsoring states have to further weigh involvement against the commitment to international law and the possibility that they are eventually cut off by competing Clarion-Clipperton Zone claims, with commentators suggesting that the Trump administration itself has to consider whether, quote, a unilateral approach may secure minerals in the short term, but erode the Pacific partnerships and deterrence architecture the United States needs for long-term security. Third, with the latest moves, we have to pay particular attention to the difference between exploitation within national jurisdiction and the high seas, i.e. the area, and what that means for the non-self-governing Pacific, the changing fortunes of states like Kiribati, and the role of China. All three shifts bring more leverage, but more risk, and the calculation for those who hope to capitalize by being first movers is clearly shifting. Please change. Here in New Zealand, I followed the recent events in Guam and the Northern Marianas and joining the call for a moratorium alongside at least 10 other Pacific nations, including the majority of Micronesia. I also noted the recent NOAA exploration in American Samoa, despite their previous moratorium, and the reported Marine Minerals Administration plans to offer lease sales in American Samoa in August 2026, CNMI in November 2026, and the Alaska in December 2026. Here, please change. Here in New Zealand, I've made a repeated request to the government asking for an update on its position, given our coalition government's enthusiasm for restarting offshore oil exploration and revelations that New Zealand is itself considering a critical minerals deal with the United States. Prompting a limited response from MFAT, is effectively saying that New Zealand maintains support for a moratorium beyond national jurisdiction only, I suppose you can read between the lines. You'll see that Greenpeace and Māori Foreign Affairs consultative groups have advanced arguments questioning defence end use and the importance of Indigenous rights and other treaty obligations, free, prior and informed consent, for example, and raising the issues of Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau. Please change. But if you look at the issue from the perspective of leverage and mutual reinforcement, the choice of whether to mine or not is about trading off the decades of political capital invested in credible ocean stewardship, which I spoke to before through Namir and other things. And someone like me typically stops there, believing that the moratorium is a more powerful regional position because of our position elsewhere in climate negotiations, for example. However, if one continues down that track, you might also consider the ability to shape the governance regime by engaging. And if so, this should be done collectively, as we see so clearly now how sponsoring states like Tonga, Nauru, and Kiribati have been played off against each other and now risk being undercut altogether. While the collective position and moral authority has already been weakened, their interest might nevertheless be shifting towards the type of regional response that they have thus far rejected, and a coordinated approach could resist the unilateral actions of the United States, reassert an approach underpinned by international law, and endeavour to set minimum environmental standards, fair compensation, technology transfer, etc. The overwhelming Pacific interest is now in withholding consent and setting the terms of access. Micronesia could lead this at the sub-regional level, for example, and utilise mechanisms and groupings like OPOC, the Office of Pacific Ocean Commissioner, the PCIDs, or even SPREC, now that the United States has withdrawn, for example. Please change. Second, I want to talk about the uses that these defence critical minerals are overwhelmingly intended for, namely the development of highly networked advanced military technologies. On screen, you'll see Andrew, the Silicon Valley defence contractor's extra large uncrewed undersea vehicle called a Ghost Shark, and the badge for Project Overmatch, which is the US Navy's contribution to combined joint all-domain command and control. I think it visualizes really perfectly the idea that emerging domains make us kind of chained as islands. Next slide, please. Or what I've called elsewhere, part of a network empire. A key part of next generation warfighting appears to be platform integration, and I'm particularly interested in the information sharing aspect of these technologies and the implication for alliance structures and sovereign capability. You can read more in detail in this article, but the summary is here, that these systems, known colloquially as killwebs, integrate data from sensors, including drones, radars, and satellites, which is then processed by AI-assisted deciders for targeting by effectors such as missiles and kamikaze drones. Conceived as an Internet of Military Things, each platform is in constant communication to enable coordinated multi-domain attacks at machine speed. Please change. This raises the question of information sharing to partners and potentially to their lethal, autonomous, and nuclear-capable weapon systems. New Zealand, for example, cooperates in military experimentation in this area as part of the Five Eyes interoperability working groups and has developed national policy caveats to govern data exchanges when operating alongside coalition partners in multinational deployments. But almost no information exists in the public domain about their scope. Please change. This has become an issue for New Zealand with the actions of the Trump administration as the Department of War seeks to integrate AI within the combined joint all-domain command and control system, leading to historic investment in highlighting the role of controversial Silicon Valley defense contractors like Palantir in supplying the Maven Smart system. New Zealand, for example, does not support the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems in combat, but is sharing information with those countries that do. Please change. Of course, the broader so-called Indo-Pacific is a central theatre within this effort, and operational integration, quote, with allies and partners is all important, seen as in the words of General Whiting of Space Command, and it has prompted an increasing number of exercises, as listed on the right of the screen, with the accusation this is accelerating the militarization of the Pacific. Please change. Networked militaries will be an issue for Pacific nations as their own and others' surveillance capabilities are further enhanced. Because while Pacific nations will want to utilize drones, especially for maritime domain awareness, policing, and disaster relief, and it is important these legitimate uses are not foreclosed, questions remain around coastal states' rights as well as the threshold of lethality with respect to foreign military assets in our region. Please change slowly 3 times. Recent operations conducted by Fiji, Marshall Islands, and the Forum Fisheries Agency in Operation Calypso, Nightwatch, and Kurukuru, which were just shown on the last couple of screens that flashed by, show the increased application of space-based and uncrewed systems in maritime domain awareness, RUU fishing surveillance, and transnational crime. We should be conscious that this technology is dual use and follows the same logic as the coalition activities and advanced warfighting systems described earlier, insofar as it's all about integrating sensor data for AI-driven processing and remote targeting. Please change. My broader point is that sea drones and information sharing as part of a push for Pacific interoperability or other integration is a potential challenge at the regional level that could implicate sovereignty. On screen is the latest SPUTM communique, but I think I'll skip that because we don't have time. Please change. From a mutual reinforcement point of view, and given the secretive nature of such systems and the limited monitoring capacity of Pacific countries, without a coordinated approach, currently even benign use may intentionally normalize foreign drone presence, create fragmentary consent, and weaken long-term coastal state control. There is a strong regional interest in pushing for greater transparency, oversight, and regional guidelines to ensure emerging technologies are deployed for peaceful purposes, do not contribute to spiraling competition or deepen surveillance. The New Age Treaty and its subsidiary agreement make provision for developing regionally agreed procedures and information sharing. The Pacific ICT Minister's Langatoi Declaration emphasizes cybersecurity as a component of strengthened regional security. And similarly, the Ocean of Peace Declaration mentioned the responsible use of technology in its operative text, for example. Please change. Just to conclude, I wanted to share some inspirational history to inform a frank contemporary assessment that emerging domains are engaging the region and the international aspects of Micronesian security in ways that risk deepening current structural constraints that they place us within island chains. And we see that so clearly with deep sea mining and sea drones, how strategic relevance drives rapid domain development, how Pacific nations rely on external technical expertise and capital funding, how often there's a presence of non-state actors that complicate things, and how, people going out on their own, signing exclusive deals, undercuts the regional position or provides fragmentary consent, and ultimately potentially sees the right to set the rules and locks us into platform dependency. Nevertheless, with more coordination and mutual reinforcement, strategies like sequencing, withholding consent, emerging domains, these same areas present opportunities for new types of governance mechanisms that are capable of leveraging strategic relevance or establishing preemptive norms to strengthen collective agency and safeguard sovereignty. What Swindy and I have called the barrier reef strategy. Just Masi, I hope I was able to be heard there. I appreciate there was a lot, and I welcome your questions. Thank you again for the opportunity, and my appreciation to PCIS for having me.
Sidus Masi, Dr. Jong, for a fascinating presentation on sort of the emerging domains that we need to be aware of, and the fact that it's not hopeless. We're rooted in history, that Micronesia has come together as on a sub-regional level and on a regional level to ensure that we have norms that are put in place that can help protect our ocean. So we have time for questions, so I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you have a question for Dr. De Jong, you have microphones right in front of you. Please go ahead and just unmute. We can ask him. Marco, are you able to hear the Dr. Underwood speaking? We're just going to fix the mic situation real quick. Exist.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a great presentation. And as Dr. Cooper has outlined, it introduces the whole idea, rearranges and updates the idea of thinking about strategy in new technological fields. So I'm really interested in the barrier reef approach, which implies, a kind of a new barrier reef approach to resolving or dealing with these issues. What do you do if you're a territory and not a sovereign nation? And how does that get? How do those areas can they participate in your conceptualization of a barrier reef approach?
I was thinking a lot about that this morning when I considered that example of the deep sea mining, and I thought especially of that risk of the unilateral action through American Samoa, through Guam and the Commonwealth and Northern Marianas. This was a particular vulnerability. Having a non-self-governing, non-sovereign Pacific allows that's an easy in and a way to totally undercut the idea of a barrier reef. However, then I thought that when I considered that the impacts that action might have, for example, on those sponsoring states like Guam, Nauru, and Kiribati, I thought, well, their interests in this the kind of given the actions is actually now to support the non-sovereign Pacific in trying to withhold consent because their own position has been undercut. So in that sense, I think that working as part of diverse coalitions, the idea that you can have different sequence, but not everyone has to be on the same kind of totalizing unitary approach. I think it actually makes it probably more possible. And I think too about the Cook Islands and Niue and Tokelau, because New Zealand has its own territory, and I feel like in the case of Tokelau, that is often it's neglected in the foreign policy of New Zealand, certainly, but it also, with those that share interests, it can be a way of coming together in different types of coalitions which respect Indigenous rights, for example. There are other opportunities that are also provided by the other side of that coin.
From the room, you can be thinking about it. We do have a question from online, Dr. De Jong, so I'll go ahead and read the question from online. How do you think the recent acceleration of quote unquote development projects across Micronesia that are intended for dual use by outside militaries, example, Peleliu and Yap airstrips, ports, depots, etc., in Guam and Tinian as well, affect regional governance?
I've been really concerned about this in the context of the Ocean of Peace. I wrote an article which spelled out the issue of, I suppose, this issue of dual use. And I suppose I took inspiration from the peaceful purposes reservations, which are international law and things like UNCLOS and the Antarctic Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty. And the point that was made that, we have to try and safeguard, because dual use is a way for these technologies to enter, and become proliferated and become part of everyday use such that they can't be disentangled. And I think to other kind of humanitarian assistance and disaster response functions of military, other effective de facto bases, which are humanitarian warehouses in name, for example, or the famous ones around port access and this type of thing. So I've been thinking about this, and I thought that idea of peaceful purposes, that there are certain things like, weapons testing, certain military maneuvers or exercises, strategic intelligence gathering. These things are already described as, non-peaceful actions in international law. And I thought that there could be other ways that, for example, people have looked at the Treaty of Rarotonga and the fact that it prohibits stationing as an effective way of preventing basing. That approach, I think, is good. You can try and disentangle, the parts that you want to keep. I think this is something so key with the sea drones and maritime domain awareness. It's likely that Pacific nations will really want sea drones to monitor huge swathes of the EEZ. The trouble is that where that information is going and how elsewise you're being incorporated into systems of command and control that are designed for remote targeting is vexed. So that's the central question, and I think a lot more work needs to go into it.
You, Sidus Mossy. Anyone? Questions from the room? Please just grab the microphone. If not, we actually do have another one, so I'll give some people time to think of your question. This is another online. Thank you so much for this presentation. Sorry, I didn't bring my glasses today, so it might be a little slow. One of the claims that the metals company has made is that the territories are so colonized and culturally eroded that we do not maintain cultural sovereignty and spiritual ties to the waters surrounding us and the trench. This is blatant racism, resource domination, and economic colonization in one blow. How can the territories especially respond to these claims that we are so heavily colonized that we cannot make the claims for indigenous rights? Is there any way to show that to Dr. Jong on the screen as well, just in case my eyes messed that up?
I think the question came through clearly. I mean, I would point to that history as an example of, it's clear that Pacific nations have not just emphasized the cultural value of the ocean, but things like the unique dependence on marine resources, as well as advancing science about its interconnected nature, which are found, which created that new scientific consensus, which allowed the deep sea, the high sea pockets of the Noumea Convention area to be excluded. That was accepted by the United States. This was a massive achievement, and it was based on work that was done through SPREP, in the late 70s and early 80s. That speaks to the long history. You'll see from the slides that Guam was the one that initiated that particular challenge and worked with Kiribati in the London Dumping Convention, for example. I mean, this is a story of power, the power of islands, and the continuing importance of a Pacific environmentalism. I totally reject the idea that we have such cultural poverty in our ocean. It's ridiculous. I don't think it's borne out by evidence. In fact, I think the opposite is quite true. Maybe that's a plug for better learning our histories and standing firm. I will say, however, that the regional fragmentation over the DSM issue has not served us. So we go into this current moment where some Pacific nations have gone out on a limb and that their regional position has been undercut. And I think that, I suppose my point earlier was that maybe it's too late, but not too late, to bring it back in and try it at the regional or sub-regional level to try and shore up those key ideas. Because we've invested decades of political capital into ocean stewardship, credible ocean governance.
Emerging domains and technologies, but should there be a different strategy or tactic at the sub-regional approach, like here in Micronesia, for example? How do you think it's the same strategy and tactics for both the regional and sub-regional level, or are there distinctions that matter?
I think working the sub-regions first is such an important part of it. And I say that with reference to the ICJ advisory opinion effort. If you think about how that was progressed and you think of the success of that, as opposed to, say, the Ocean of Peace, which produced quite like an unambitious text, which simply reaffirmed all of the other things around security, whereas the ICJ advisory opinion going from the student level, supported nationally by Vanuatu, into the MSG, and working at the UN level at that point, and then bringing, after you have a coalition, to the regional level. I think that that's a very good approach. Otherwise, working through the PSIDs and AOSIS, where there's not Australia and New Zealand in the forum, is very strong too. I mentioned their SPREC, that the US have pulled out of SPREC. Like this is another potential avenue that is opened. The diverse positioning, it's about working the strategic the terrain between the groupings, and advancing things that are up channels to try and engage early, but coordinate. So I think. I think I point the point there that Micronesia on DSM is so strong because I think it's only Kiribati that isn't currently in support of a moratorium. So that would be such a good avenue.
If leaving one more opportunity for the table to ask questions. Going once, going twice. If not, I'd like to thank Dr. Jong for your presentation today. You've left us with a lot of good meat to think about. And we'll definitely be reaching out to you more and more as these emerging domains define. And you only gave two primary examples, right? But there are so many more examples of things that should be on our radar that maybe is not on our radar as much as it should be. So thank you. Sijua Smasi, Dr. De Jong. Have a great remainder of your day. Thank you. And for our viewing audience, we're going to take a 10-minute break before moving on to our second presentation of the afternoon. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the live stream for our live audience. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for our next presentation by Mr. James Crabtree. James Crabtree is an author and geopolitical strategist with extensive experience living and working in Asia. He's a distinguished visiting fellow in the Asia program of the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, a fellow at the Asia Society in New York, and a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. He is currently writing his second book called The Perimeter, The Struggle for Primacy in the Pacific, which examines the future of America's military presence in Asia. His first book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, was shortlisted as Financial Times McKinsey's Business Book of the Year and was also named an Amazon Book of the Year. Previously, he was the Singapore-based executive director of the Institute of International Strategic Studies in Asia, where he led the organization of the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Summit, and he was an associate professor in practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School. James also spent 10 years as a journalist and foreign correspondent, notably for the Financial Times, where he was both Mumbai bureau chief and common editor. He writes for a range of global publications from the FT and the New York Times to Foreign Affairs, and he's also a senior advisor at both Think Global and the London Defence Conference, and previously worked in the UK Prime Minister's strategy unit under Prime Ministers Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. He's worked for various think tanks in London and Washington, D.C., and was a Fulbright scholar at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Crabtree, thank you so much for joining us today, James. We really look forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us. So sorry I couldn't be there in person. It's nice to see the room, so I'm going to wave at you, see if I can get you to wave at me. See, there we are. I don't know. I think this is the after lunch session, which is always tricky, but it's 5 a.m. In London. So if you think it's bad for you, then think about those of us for whom it's still dark outside. I agreed to do this in part because I was immensely grateful to Kenneth and his team when I came to Guam as part of my research. One of the things that you learn as a researcher is that you're entirely sort of reliant on the generosity of others to learn about the things that you're trying to learn about. And so Kenneth and his team at the university were very generous with their time. And so insofar as I'm able, I thought I should talk about, what I've been doing. Now, I think we've got 20 minutes, maybe only 15 now. I'm going to sort of talk through some slides, and then we've got another 20 minutes for discussion. So there's a lot of kind of detailed question about the nature of US strategy in the Indo-Pacific that we can get into in the questions. What I intend to do is really just to try and explain what I've been up to in trying to produce this second book, and then we can dig into what that might mean for the question of your conference, specifically about Micronesia. I mean, I suppose I should say that the reason why I came to Guam was that I'm not an expert in Micronesia in any sense, and I was coming to try and learn. I'd never been to Guam before, and so there are going to be other people at your conference who are more expert in this particular topic. But I suppose the research that I've been doing, I hope, might help to place the security challenges faced by Micronesia and the role of Guam in particular within a broader context of what's going on in the wider Indo-Pacific, and that might be helpful. So, and just a sort of word about me. I mean, you heard my background. Really, the background to this occurred when I was in Singapore initially at the Lee Kuan Yew School, but then principally in the years when I ran the Shangri-La Dialogue for the IISS. And not all of you will be familiar with the IISS. It's a UK-based think tank. And for historical reasons, it is the organizer of the annual Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the premier security conference of Asia each year, attended by all of the region's defense ministers and including the defense ministers in normal years of both the United States and China. And so I used to run this every year. We never had participation from Micronesia formally, but Indo-PACOM would come. The commander of Indo-PACOM would come every year, and so things that related to Micronesian security were discussed in that forum. And so if you go to the next slide, really the beginning of this was 10 years or so ago when I arrived in Singapore, and I would occasionally be invited to high-level gatherings, private discussions with American military leaders. And during the course of those discussions, people would begin to talk about the first and second island chains, which you can see on the map here, and with which you'll all be very familiar. You see Guam in the right-hand side. And I became more and more intrigued by exactly what the strategic importance of the island chains was in the new era, and where this conception of the importance of the island chains, both from the American side and the Chinese side, had come from. And it seemed to me that there was a yawning gap between the military and strategic understanding of these island chains as in many ways the most important geostrategic dividing lines and pressure points in the world, and the underlying source of great power competition between the US and China, and the public understanding of these things, which was completely minimal, and still I believe is, as in normally when I tell people I'm writing a book about the first island chain, and I ask people, do you know what the first island chain is? Then maybe in a room like this, where you're all experts on Indo-Pacific security, then that would seem a stupid question. But actually, most people out there in the world have got no idea what the first and second island chains are, let alone whether they matter. Normally, people tell me that what the first island chain is the 9-dash line. And so the book that I'm writing, The Perimeter, attempts to tell the story of the kind of the creation of the island chain concept, which goes back to the post-war period, and then its development, in a sense, from the Truman presidency right the way through to the Trump presidency, and then where this might go in the future. So that's what I've been doing. And so, I mean, originally I had grand plans for the book, which is that I would do the first and second island chains expansively, including going to Papua New Guinea at the bottom of the second island chain, for instance, and spend much more time in Micronesia and go to see different bits of the Northern Marianas, so the Marianas Islands where Guam is located. And ultimately, even for a book which takes a couple of years, you end up running out of time and not being able to do everything that you wanted. But the last couple of years, I have traveled throughout the first and second island chain and Hawaii to try and understand this. So Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, China, a bunch, the US, in order to try and get a picture of this. So let me sort of rattle through the slides and talk about this a little bit. And then we can ask a little bit about where this sits within the focus of your conference. So next slide. So this is me in Taiwan. That was a big part of so you can see what I normally look like when I'm not just on the screen. This is the presidential office in Taiwan. And I suppose the reason why I would highlight Taiwan is that insofar as we think about the island chains conceptually, then most of the effort is placed on Taiwan itself, which is, somebody once described it to me. I think a Chinese general once described it to me as the belt buckle of the belt of the island chain. So it is clearly a critical part of this geographic construct. But I suppose part of the argument that I'm trying to make in the book is that it's quite difficult to understand the strategic importance of the island chain by simply looking at Taiwan on its own. As in if you look at, I begin the book with a war game scenario that was published in 2023 by CSIS, which is one of the most realistic scenarios for a Chinese amphibious attack on Taiwan. And one of the core findings of that, it's in the public domain, is that Japan in particular is, the United States can never defend Taiwan successfully, or Taiwan can never defend itself successfully without having access to Japan. And in a broader sense, it also ideally needs access to not just the rest of the island chain, particularly Luzon in the Philippines, but also the assets that it has positioned in the second island chain, and particularly on Guam and the islands of Micronesia, are militarily critical to any sort of successful scenario. And so, although Taiwan sucks up a sort of inordinate amount of attention, then you have to understand both of the island chains as a whole and the complicated set of relationships within them. I mean, not simply, for instance, domestic political dynamics where you are in Guam and the views of the local population against the military, but also the domestic political situations in the Philippines, Japan, what that allows the United States to do, how it's cooperating with its allies and partners, and so on and so forth. So next slide. I mean, I think one of the things that I try to do, this image here is of the Japanese co-prosperity sphere as envisaged by Imperial Japan in the 1930s. I don't think we have Guam on there. It doesn't appear. But in a sense, what I was trying to do was to locate the island chains within their historical context, pre-war, as in partly this vision of a sort of single country dominating the region is important because it animates some of the way that the United States thinks about the risk of Chinese control of the region, as in you have people like Matt Pottinger, the former Deputy National Security Advisor, who very explicitly will say that the risk that the region faces if China were to break out of and dominate the region around the island chain is one in which China would become overwhelmingly the dominant power and the United States would be pushed out. But you also have in that period, in the pre-war period, a very obvious sense of the importance of controlling the island chains for the sort of strategic dominance of the region, as in Japan did in the war period and built a kind of regional dominance. And then the islands were then critical both to the economic strangulation of Japan during the war, and then ultimately the retaking of the island chain by the United States at great cost after the war. So I think it's also important to understand the sort of the further back history of this. Next slide. Really, though, the story begins, the one that I tell begins in January of 1950. So on the left here, you have Dean Acheson, and Acheson sort of slightly is really the hero of the book. So I begin with what's called his perimeter speech, which was given at the press club in Washington on January 1950, where he laid out what some people call the Acheson line, which was the American defense perimeter in the Pacific, the perimeter from which my book title is taken. Now, as many of you will know, there's a whole controversy, which I'll skip over, about where the perimeter line was initially drawn. I mean, you can see that on this map, it doesn't initially include Taiwan or South Korea. There was then the Korean invasion and the Korean War, which led to the US perimeter being redrawn, in a sense, to include both South Korea and Taiwan, and that is the position that it's held ever since. But this is the basis and the history of why the US decided in the wartime and immediately post-war period that it needed to have a defensive perimeter right on the other side of the Pacific, that it wasn't, the pre-war situation where its perimeter line effectively ran through Hawaii wasn't ideal. And therefore, given they were the world's dominant only superpower, they were going to push right forward. And I suppose, in a sense, the contention of the book is one with which you will all be familiar, which is that, in a sense, is the situation that we're still in. And that this has been a remarkably stable part of the way that we understand global geopolitics, almost to the point that we don't pay much attention to it because it seems like the natural order of things, that the first island chain exists and the United States has a series of allies and partners along the first island chain, particularly the Philippines and Japan, but also Taiwan as a close partner, who are either allied or cooperating with the United States, and that this is American geopolitical real estate. Next slide. The sort of the challenge, though, is that there's enormous pressure on this now. And therefore, if you are the commander of Indo-PACOM, this is the entrance to Camp Smith, which is where Admiral Paparo has his headquarters, which I visited in the course of my research. If you're sitting in Hawaii trying to work out, what your strategy is, then much of what you're thinking about is how do I sustain the current position that we have along the island chain, and how do I use that as best advantage, to our best advantage, to deter China from principally a scenario involving Taiwan, but potentially some others as well. I mean, there are other actions that China could take that would be very destabilizing to regional security for instance, building more artificial islands in the South China Sea, particularly at Scarborough Shoal. And so, in a sense, the stability of the island chain and the way in which the US tries to support it is very important. Next slide. You have to see this within a wider regional security picture. So, you have the island chain to the north, but you also have the kind of tensions elsewhere in the region. So I tell a number of episodes within the book, one of which is the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I think was very formative to the way that China views the region. You also have bleeding into this the kind of security situation in the South China Sea, particularly around the Spratly Islands, where, as you will all be aware, China has built a series of man-made islands and has increased its security hold over the South China Sea. Hasn't yet done so in Scarborough Shoal, and that's which is marked there on the map. I mention this partly because it's very important within the context of the US-Philippines alliance, but in this sort of part of the broader picture. And what is China trying to do here? Well, China is trying to do something which is very sensible from a Chinese perspective, which it is trying to dominate the region around its near abroad, and it has successfully moved itself into a position where it is now the dominant military player in the South China Sea. And what it really ultimately seeks to do is in various ways to push the United States away from the first island chain, in order so that it can dominate that part of the world economically and militarily, and at some point, either militarily or through other means, resolve the question of Taiwan's status, which is at the core of this. Next slide. Broader context too, you have to see this within the context of the Indo-Pacific in general, which is that if the island chain is at the core of the process of great power competition, which is currently ongoing, and we're going to see this tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow, President Trump arrives in China to have his latest meeting with President Xi in Beijing, in which the security prospects of Taiwan will, in some sense, be discussed. You have a much wider regional balance in which you have some countries, principally the US allies, India, it says Vietnam on this. This is not my map. This is the New York Times. I think you can argue the case in many of these as to how the powers in the region are behaving with respect to US-China competition. But anyway, there's a sort of wider regional picture here that we can talk about if it's of interest. Next slide. So the real story that my book tells is there's a military dimension to it, which is really, and this is relevant to, very relevant to Micronesia and to Guam, which is about the development of area denial capabilities. This is really one of the first times I've talked about the book in this way. Area denial capabilities, I'm sure you will all be aware, principally the use of long-range missiles, but other technologies like mines, to make it much more difficult for a country to enter the sort of specific geography. And so to put this in sort of narrative terms, in 1996, you had the third Taiwan Strait crisis. President Clinton sailed the two carriers close to the Taiwan Straits. It was very humiliating for China. China decided it must never be humiliated like this again. And so over a 20, 30-year period, China has been developing this very sophisticated sort of system of missiles that make, in a conflict time, mean that it would be almost impossible for the United States to bring its most important military assets close to Taiwan, or at least it would be very risky in doing that. So that they have created this area denial bubble. And then in response, the question posed to the commanders at Indo-PACOM in the United States is, well, what are they going to do given this fact on the ground, which is that China didn't used to have a very capable area denial bubble, and now they do? Well, how then do you react? What do you? And I suppose if I were to put this very crudely, the strategic question is: do you hang back, as in, do you retreat to the second island chain and Guam, which, although it is vulnerable to missile attack, as you will all be aware, given the debates about the missile shield and vulnerability to long-range ballistic missiles, is still out of the range of a lot of the Chinese missiles that you'll see here? Or do you have to push forward? And really, this has been the big strategic debate in the US over the last 10 or 15 years. And mostly it has been won by those who believe that you want to be able to push forward in various different respects. And so part of the story that I tell in the book is that debate within the US strategic community and the result in which you have had a complete reconfiguration of bits, well, not a complete, a partial and ongoing reconfiguration of elements of US military power in order to respond to the reality of China's missile shield. On the one hand, and the U.S. Marine Corps is the most important part of that, and we can talk about that principally because it's very significant to Guam, as you will all know, given Camp Blas and the anticipated relocation that has not yet happened of Marines from Okinawa to Guam, which isn't happening. And the reason why it isn't happening is that the U.S. Marines don't want it to happen. The U.S. Marines want to be forward along the First Island chain. They don't want to be hanging back in Guam. And so you have that dynamic of, how does the US seek to deter China and potentially fight a war given China's missile bubble? But then you also have, in a sense, a balancing dynamic, which is that Taiwan and the United States, and to some degree the Philippines and also Japan, are also now developing their own area denial capabilities, as in they are also sort of defensive capabilities. They're developing, also long-range strike, but other kinds of asymmetric capabilities to try and deter China from ever taking action against Taiwan. And this back and forth dynamic, China creates an area denial bubble. How do we respond? And should we not also create an area denial bubble to stop the Chinese ever doing anything aggressive? Has been the sort of underlying structural dynamic of competition within the region, and the one in which the security of Micronesia and the role of Guam is central, because Guam is the ultimate sort of regional backstop and the source of much of US military power in the region, given the various, given Anderson Air Force Base and the naval base and the submarine base, and a lot of things that are happening in Guam. And therefore, every branch of the US military has been trying to adapt to these changes. Next slide. Here is an example, for instance, of Japan as the most important regional partner. It has also been seeking to use its portion of the island chain, not just mainland Japan, but the Ryukyus, the southwest island of Japan, not simply for the US to bulk up its presence in Okinawa, which is the kind of principal US base in the middle of the Southwest Islands, where, for instance, the major strategic change has been with the Marine Corps and the creation of the Marine Littoral Regiments, of which there are two, one of which is based in Okinawa, which I can talk about at great length if you're interested in what the Marines are up to. But Japan is also, part of the story that I tell in the book is not simply about the United States. It's also about China, but it's also about Japan and principally the Philippines, a little bit about Australia. But, the role that Japan is playing in the region is changing. And one of the things I haven't done in this presentation is talk about President Trump, which we can talk about more in the questions. But sort of at the core of this is a question that American allies and partners have about the reliability of the United States as a long-term partner, which is partly a long-term kind of strategic question, as in, regional partners weigh up the relative balance of the US and China, and they ask, well, how capable is the United States of helping us to defend ourselves, given its balance against China, which has deteriorated, on any reasonable calculus over the last couple of decades. But then there's a more important, more urgent question, which is how reliable is the United States as a partner? And that has been brought very sharply back into question by the return of President Trump in the White House, given President Trump is more willing than his predecessors to kind of negotiate with the Chinese, and he also has particular attitudes to allies, and he doesn't seem to care very much about Taiwan. So not just given events of this week when you have Trump in China, but more generally, if you're within the US strategic community, in Japan, in Philippines, in Taiwan, there are a lot of very existential questions at the moment about the role that the United States is playing in the region and whether it will continue to play the role that it has played. And therefore, one of the reactions to that, if you're a country like Japan, is to think, well, we have to do more for our own security. We have to do this for a number of reasons, one of which is that we have to demonstrate to the United States that we're doing more for our own security. Otherwise, President Trump might criticize us. But also we have to do more for our own security because we suspect that the United States over time is going to do less, as in the willingness of the United States to be the dominant security provider is declining, and therefore we have to do more. And so in Japan, part of what that means is that Japan is militarizing its Southwest Islands, for instance, by developing long-range strike capabilities of its own, which it could use to defend those islands and deter China, and potentially would become important in a Taiwan Strait contingency. Next slide. Yes, so I talked about this a little bit already, but really the question becomes if you assume that the United States is still committed to the defense of Taiwan and to holding the island chain, then how are they going to do that? And the vision that is currently being followed, in some sense, for instance, by the figure who most people would identify with this is Elbridge Colby, who's now the Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon, author of State of Denial. He outlined and is now executing to some degree a strategy which he calls a denial defense. Others call an archipelagic defense, in which you reorient the US military posture in the region to basically go hell for leather to deter the Chinese over Taiwan. And as you can see here, part of the sort of the reason why this matters for Guam and Micronesian security is that it places a lot of pressure on Guam as the sort of the base in the rear from which you are seeking to push forward, both in terms of posture in peacetime, but also potentially in conflict. And therefore, part of what I do in the book is try and explain, what is this idea of archipelagic defense and where did it come from? I'm so conscious we're running short of time and we should get to questions. So let me just rattle through the rest of it, which next slide, which is really just to tell you a little bit about my research and to show you that I did indeed come to visit Guam. So, this is welcome to Guam at the airport. Next slide. One of the things that's great fun about being a journalist is that, I'm a kind of recovering journalist as opposed to an academic of the sort that you have in your room. I very much enjoy the research component of coming to visit different places and trying to understand their culture and meet the people who are there. Next slide. I enjoyed learning a little bit about the finer things that Guam has to offer. Next slide. I also got to meet some of the kind of decision makers. So I went to Joint Region Marianas and met the commander there. Next slide. And many of you will have done this. I got to sit around the table that sits in the Joint Command, where various luminaries, including Admiral Nimitz and others, have sat. Next slide. And certainly at the time, I got to meet some of your political leaders as well, which was very illuminating, and so I was grateful for that. Next slide. I suppose that the sort of question, there are a whole range of developments about security in Micronesia which you will be talking about, and there are sort of politics to that as well, which Kenneth and others at the university have dealt with, as in the extent to which the local population of Micronesia is comfortable with the behavior of the US military and the direction of US strategy, what its attitude is to China. I don't have time to get into all of that, and I'm by far from an expert in it. In a sense, I was coming to learn. But I suppose the core of what I'm talking about in the book is the way that the US military looks at its various assets. And I thought this was very illuminating in this respect, which was some remarks by Eric Smith, who's now the commandant of the Marine Corps, who talked about Camp Blas and, in a sense, why it was that the plans to relocate all of the forces from Okinawa hadn't happened. And he basically said the quiet part out loud, which was that as I said before, that if you're part of the US Marine Corps, you don't really want to move back to Guam, and that's why BLAS has been set up. But as far as I'm aware, last time I checked, it only had a couple of hundred people in it as opposed to the full complement. That might be something of a relief to Guam, because as I have understood it, the military population on your island is set to increase dramatically as the US builds up forces in the region in anticipation of a long-term period of geostrategic competition with China. But it also speaks to the way that the individual forces are kind of responding to the challenge of China, either by seeking to push forward posture along the first island chain, or to disperse forces along the second island chain, which gets you into questions about Tinian and Yap and the various other islands in the Northern Marianas, and how, in a sense, there are new facilities being built there as well. And I understand, and in a sense, Kenneth and others talked me through the fact that this remains, complicated and difficult, and there are various different ways that one should understand the willingness of the local population to be part of that. But anyway, I mean, I don't particularly go into that in any great detail in the book, but I suppose it's just to say that I am aware of that as a context for which perhaps your conference discusses, and in which the points that I've made might sit. Next slide. So that's it, really. That in a sense is what I've been doing. My book comes out in January. If I'm very lucky, maybe I will get to come back to Guam, and Kenneth will host me for a book event, or perhaps I could come in person to your conference in 2027, which would be a great delight. I think it's quite unlikely that those of you in the room will pass through London at any point soon, because I know Guam and Micronesia is quite a long distance away from where I am. But were you to do so, it would be a great delight to see visitors from Guam in our part of the world. And there are people in Europe, I should say. I mean, it's a bit odd that I'm a European sitting in London talking to you about this, but there are lots of people in Europe who see and follow the strategic importance of your region, because it does have consequences not just for ours, but in the same way that what happens in Ukraine or what happens in Iran has consequences for the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and very concrete consequences in things like, the ability of the US to supply weapons to Taiwan, or to defend an island like Guam from missile attack. Then so what happens in your region has a very direct implication for what happens in my region. And so one of the sort of the interconnected nature of global security, I mean, means that there are people in places like London who are interested in what happens in Guam, and hopefully there are people in Guam who are interested in what happens in Ukraine and in our part of the world. And so I hope that's a useful dialogue. And I think now we're going to have a period of question and answer, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And thank you once again, particularly to Kenneth, for whom I was very, very grateful for his help and sort of kind advice during the research part of the book. So, Kenneth, over to you. Now, I can't hear you. I think you must be on mute somehow. So I don't know if you can still hear me, but now I think maybe I can hear you.
All right. Just give you a stellar round of applause. I think we may have overloaded the microphones. That's why I was on mute. But honestly, James, thank you so much. Really, this was what we wanted the meat of the presentation to be, is how do events occurring in the first island chain, how do shifts and trends affect us here? And then obviously, how do events that happen in Micronesia affect the rest of the world? And you so well and eloquently articulated those points. So, si dua smasi. I am going to open it up for questions from the audience. So please be brainstorming, but we do have one online. So the person online is asking, are there ways that Micronesian countries and territories could engage the Philippines and Japan around security concerns generated by US-China competition?
I mean, absolutely. I'm sure that there are. So, I mean, how would it sort of seems to me that the kind of the central dynamic, and this is one that, Kenneth, as I have understood your research and the research of others around Micronesia, the question that it sort of seemed to me the kind of fundamental question is one about the agency of sort of other participants in this debate, and so the local population in Guam would be one example of this, but then the broader islands of the Marianas and Micronesia, But it's also true of other, you might see countries in Southeast Asia in this, people who have a great stake in this debate, who don't want to merely be seen as pawns on a giant strategic chessboard that is dominated principally by, military security considerations. And therefore, yes, I think if I were to think about, and Philippines is slightly different because Philippines, how to put this, only latterly has the Philippine strategic community begun to see itself as part of this wider regional picture. It's quite a recent development that really dates to the arrival of President Marcos in power, where the Philippine strategic elite has begun to both understand at a deeper level and also participate in a kind of what they call a one theater concept, in which, but still, the Philippines is still quite, has less of a sort of strategic regional overview, principally concerned with the South China Sea and security threats in the South China Sea. And to the extent that it thinks about a Taiwan contingency, it thinks about it initially as a domestic security challenge, namely that there are 250,000 Filipinos stuck in Taiwan who'd have to be removed. And so there are people within the Philippine strategic community who now sort of look at the first island chain and second island chain, but it's relatively recent. In Japan, this is much more mainstream. There is a very sophisticated strategic community within Japan who think about this, because obviously it's absolutely core. Japan, if you just look at the map, Japan makes up most of the first island chain, and it is a kind of article of faith within the Japanese strategic community that if there is a Taiwan contingency, then Japan is going to have to go to war with China. Not only that, but that Japan will be attacked by China, that in the end, the way that the military dynamics of a scenario around Taiwan will play out mean that it's almost preordained that China would not be able to launch an amphibious invasion successfully without first neutralizing both Japanese military forces and particularly US military forces based in Japan. And therefore, there's a kind of, it's almost inevitable. Now, this might not be true. It might be that that's not how it pans out, but that's the working assumption in Tokyo, is that if there is going to be a military contingency around Taiwan, then Japan will be attacked and will be part of that. And the scenario that I tell at the beginning of my book, the one that is based on the war games run by CSIS, that's exactly what happens, as in the Chinese launch an attack on not just on Taiwan, but on Japan as well. Now, the question that you're answering is, in a sense, how can stakeholders within Micronesia and the Marianas Islands and beyond, how can they engage in that? Because the risk, I think, that you would, underlying your questioner, but also underlying your research, Kenneth, is this sort of sense that basically the militaries don't care about what the local population think, and they view these as sort of useful assets, and they hope that any concerns that the local population have will just sort of shut up and go away. And the question is then, well, how do you get a hearing in order so that your interests, your interests as you perceive them to be, are taken into account fairly, and that there's some conceptions of justice. I presume the way that one would do this is to do it both at the kind of government to government level, but also at the kind of track 1.5, track 2 level. And I suppose, Kenneth, probably this is a question that you should probably answer, which is that you and your institution and other related institutions probably participate in regional forums like the Shangri-La Dialogue or the Raisina Dialogue or others that are specific to Japan and the Philippines, while also kind of creating and engaging forms of dialogue so that decision makers in Micronesia can understand these wider regional strategic dynamics of the kind that I'm talking about in my book, but that they can also be a voice where the views of those who live in these places are kind of heard in these discussions and not completely ignored. Now, there's an empirical question as to what extent is that actually happening, and I suppose my sense is not much, as in if I were Samuel Paparo or Bridge Colby, to what extent am I thinking about the wider context of the Marianas Islands and, what people there think? I suspect not very much. And I think the tenor of your research, Kenneth, is that actually probably, these people feel they have bigger fish to fry and they need to just get on with dealing with the Chinese and not worry too much about local complaints, be those Japanese peace protesters in Okinawa or people in Guam who are worried about the fact that the island is being excessively militarized and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work that could and should be done in terms of engagement, both with the US, but also, as you say, with Japan, Philippines, potentially Australia as well, and with Taiwan itself. And that comes with complications, as in engaging with Taiwan comes with complications, particularly if you also seek to have relations in one form or another with the Chinese. But in a sense, that's part of the broader future regional security picture. Kenneth, back to you.
A question from the table, Dr. Underwood.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm trying to figure out if you're living in the second island chain, what should we be rooting for in the first island chain? Should we be interested in seeing Japan and the Philippines take a stronger role so that the whatever potential conflict is occurring doesn't come into the second island chain? Should we be hoping for a stronger U.S. role, or should we be hoping for some kind of understanding that happens between the U.S. and China in this geostrategic competition that stabilizes the first island chain so that the second island chain just remains a geographic strategic concept that's never really fully employed?
Well, so thank you for that, Robert, and it's nice to see you. We never got a chance to meet when I came to the island, but I was very grateful for your willingness to meet. As I remember it, I think you have quite a demanding travel schedule, and I caught you off island when I was there. But it's very nice to see you, and thanks for all of the work that you've done in this area. But I think that is a fantastic question and a very difficult one to answer. I mean, I suppose my intuition is that in the short term, really what would be in the interests of the region and Micronesia in general is just stability, because in the end, anything that involves change is risky. And the challenge of the world that we're moving into at the moment is it's one in which there is quite a lot of dynamic change, and that creates risk, as in, it creates instability, and that creates tension, but also the prospect that at some point, one of the powers involved might decide to do something rash. The challenge with that, however, is that, ultimately, I mean, this is a kind of horrible cliche that people use all the time, the quote from Lampedusa, that if things are going to change, things are going to stay the same, then everything has to change. And in a sense, that's what you see at the moment, that this is the military balance. I mean, I worked for the IISS, and so it has a publication called The Military Balance. And that came from, during the Cold War, the way that we used to track the military balance between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in Europe as the kind of center of the old Cold War. And in the new Cold War between the United States and China, the center of this is the military balance across the Taiwan Straits. And that's very dynamic, as in it's not static. China is going through, as you will all be very well aware, the most enormous military modernization program in human history that's not anywhere near done. I mean, at the moment, to give one example, they have 3 aircraft carriers. There's probably plans for 6, 9 in the long run, and ultimately more than that, until, with no end in sight. And it's a military modernization that includes both the tactical up to the strategic, meaning at the nuclear level. And therefore, the kind of the balance, the attempt to keep in balance that enormous increase in, I mean, in a sense, I don't want to be anti-Chinese in this, as in, I see a lot. If I was China, I would be doing exactly what they're doing. I mean, I don't think there's anything malevolent in what they're doing. I mean, I feel like, to be fair to China, they feel like, going back to 1996, that they were humiliated by a dominant military power who is not of their own region, and therefore they need to take their own future into their own hands and make sure that they can't be humiliated militarily. Therefore, they need to have a strong military. Ideally, from their point of view, they would like to push the United States out of the first island chain. And why wouldn't you? I mean, the United States wouldn't want to have China dominating the Caribbean. That would be a militarily unacceptable position for a great power. So I have a lot of sympathy with China's position. I mean, the way that they behave in the region often is kind of coercive and difficult, but the sort of basic underlying great power logic, I don't fault them for what they're doing. I'd probably do variants of exactly the same thing in their position. But it does create this very unstable dynamic, which is that, and this I think is one of the things that in Micronesia and in the Northern Marianas and in other parts of the island chain, that is the sort of the central struggle, which is that if the United States and its allies do nothing, then ultimately China will be the dominant power in the region. I think that's absolutely clear. And so, in one form or another, then the sort of China will be the dominant economic player in the region. And so in the book, I talk quite a lot about Paul Kennedy and the rise and fall of the great powers, and sort of how you understand the way in which economic power over time comes to dominate in the military domain, and problems of imperial overstretch. And the United States very clearly is a kind of example of sort of imperial exhaustion. And so in the long term, if nothing changes, then the future is one in which China will be the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific. Now, there are some who might think, well, that's okay. We swap one dominant power for another, and, it will come with pros and cons. But certainly if you're sitting in Japan or Taiwan or the Philippines, and I think in Guam as a US territory, then that's not a very appealing prospect. And so it would be preferable to keep some variant of the current system in which you have something approaching the free and open Indo-Pacific model, in which you have a kind of balance in the region and some vestige of the old rules-based order, and that you're not kind of regressing to a situation in which you swap this system for a kind of region. I mean, the Americans would say Chinese regional hegemony. I'm not quite sure if that's the right term. Anyway, so I think, this is a long and rather rambling answer to your very sort of perceptive question, which is the central political challenge, which is that if you think basically the best solution would be to kind of keep some variation of the status quo, then the problem is that requires quite a lot of military balancing to balance the Chinese and ensure that China doesn't find itself in a position where it decides that it might at some point be wise to roll the dice militarily. And that is what, a lot of what's happening in Guam, for instance, is a consequence of that. All of the military investment that's going into Guam, which I know is sort of unpopular in various respects and causes all sorts of challenges. There are people who think, with good reason, that actually this is all counterproductive, that if you spend all of this money trying to balance the Chinese, then this just creates an arms race without end. And ultimately it makes conflict more likely, not less. And so that there's a big intellectual debate to be had about the extent to which we buy the notion of deterrence. But anyway, presently that is what we're doing. That's kind of the game at the moment, is that the dominant theory is that we have to deter the Chinese, because if not, eventually they will decide to act as President Putin did in Ukraine, or whichever historical analogy you choose to take. So I think it's a genuine debate, and I'm not here to tell you that I have all the answers, Robert. In a sense, you are in the region, and I most certainly am not. I visited Guam only very briefly to try and kind of understand a little bit as an outsider as to the views of the region. But I think, in a sense, this is a question which kind of the security establishment within your island and the islands around it have to decide to what extent are they willing to participate in the game which is currently underfoot, which is one in which the United States and its partners seeks to balance the rise of China militarily in order to hold the current status quo, in which the United States and its partners are in control of the first island chain and the second island chain. Or, and I think this is the big geostrategic question which President Trump brings into focus, is the better solution over time one in which the United States effectively retreats from the first island chain to the second, or at the very least in which the United States signals that it is no longer willing to provide security guarantees to Taiwan and will not intervene in a future Taiwan contingency, and sort of let the chips fall where they may, and that has enormous geostrategic consequences in terms of US credibility in the region, the future direction of the kind of various US alliances, and also for the role of Guam, at the moment, which is kind of the fallback option. but could in future become the front line. And so a sort of a plot. And I think all of this, if you think back to the Biden years or even the Trump 1 years, these kind of debates were just implausible. You know, the notion that the United States might voluntarily retrench, redraw the perimeter back. These were not things that the United States was willing to contemplate. I think it is now willing to contemplate these things, as in if you go to Washington, it is very clear that there is a quiet debate going on about the extent to which the United States is capable of defending Taiwan, whether it's worth the cost, whether there is some kind of rapprochement that could be stuck with China. I don't think, I'm going to the Kennedy School this week to meet partly with Graham Allison. He talks about there being a fourth communique with Taiwan over Taiwan, a kind of a new grand agreement with China about the security status of Taiwan. So I think both the macro balance, basically China becoming much stronger relative to the US and its partners, is kind of forcing this issue. But more ideologically, the arrival of President Trump, who is an unusual leader in the United States and to some degree far outside the traditional mainstream of the role, he doesn't care very much about Taiwan. He's more willing than other presidents to think about accommodation with China. He has a very dyspeptic view of allies and, what one should do with allies. Doesn't see them as long-term partners. It's more of a kind of protection racket. You'll be very well aware of this. And so I think, I suppose in conclusion, I would just say that the nature of the future Indo-Pacific security order is up for grabs in a way that wasn't true when I even first started writing this book or thinking about it. As in, the story that I thought I was going to tell was about the reinforcement of the perimeter, which is a story that really began in the late Obama years and ran through Trump 1 and all of Biden. That decade-long period, the US was, its principal aim, albeit imperfectly executed in many respects, was to reinforce its hold along the perimeter line as part of a wider pivot to Asia, which was not just in the military domain, but included, other elements. And now I think the US has basically given up on its pivot. It doesn't really seek to contest the region economically. It has nothing to say very much about trade. And so it has fallen back to the old Atchison line. And the basic strategy is to deter a military attack on Taiwan and to kind of focus on its alliances. But yes, so I think if you're thinking about this from Micronesia or looking at it from Guam, then what you think of as the ideal end state, and if you agree with me that probably the ideal end state is stability, then the kind of the question that you have to ask is how much pain are you willing to put up with in order to deliver that stability? Because in a sense, Guam stands at the very heart of Guam in particular, but also some of the other islands stand at the heart of this. And do you buy this idea of deterrence? Anyway, Robert, I would be very interested to hear your view on the question that you asked, if you see what I mean, because you'd have I'm sure you lying behind that, you yourself have a view of what you think the answer is, and I'd be interested to hear it. But I think it's a very live debate now, and it makes the kind of work that is being done by Kenneth and others and your center and the kind of the albeit small but important strategic community in Guam and around the Marianas and Micronesia in general all the more important.
I think for Guam and certainly for other entities inside the Micronesian region is trying to sort out what they can do in order to create that opportunity for stability. But at the same time, there are very strong relationships with Taiwan. There's very great deal of concern about Taiwan as an autonomous entity. There's also the idea of just going back to that, failed Pacific pivot, which everybody was awaiting that famous Pacific pivot that was supposed to combine not just military, but economic endeavors and a whole diplomatic initiative. So that Pacific pivot has been abandoned, not in terms of the military though. In terms of the militarization of the area, is like the the counter to Chinese influence is to beef up militarily, as if that were going to create the opportunity for stability. And I just think that's sort of more hopeful than possible. And at the same time, you're thinking that if you fall to the second island chain, then the second island chain almost mentally, intellectually, kind of takes on like the Maginot Line or something, where you think that this is going to be it. This is the line, and of course, then it becomes the next series of challenges for China to provoke or to enter into. And of course, economically, almost the whole region, certainly the Pacific region and much of Asia, is highly dependent upon some kind of economic relationship with China. And in this context, we're trying to figure out, well, by 2035, certainly by 2040, China will become the premier economic power in the world. And so, what does that mean in this context? What is the military defending? Because you hope that the military is defending not just its raw power and influence, but its capacity to do some good, to encourage a free and open Indo-Pacific, to encourage more trade, to encourage more sustainability especially for island societies. And so it's a very, very difficult time, very confusing time. And at the same time, also trying to find out if there's agency for Pacific Island entities. Should they be participating in the Shangri-La? Should they be entering into the first island chain business, if nothing else, other than just to keep themselves informed and let others know that they're alive and well for the time being?
Yeah, I think that latter point is exactly right, and I think it's essential really that in the way that for instance, the Pacific Island Forum was always a voice at the Shangri-La Dialogue, that it's important that the rest of the region hears from those who are affected by great power competition. And I think the basic gist of what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, I suppose my perception is that, Zach Cooper, who's a good analyst of this, wrote a good piece about this in Foreign Affairs recently, that originally, going back a decade under people like Kurt Campbell, the US had this aspiration to compete with China around the region, a sort of full spectrum kind of competition, of which the military domain was one component, but that included, going back, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, strengthening alliances, developing closer partnerships in Southeast Asia. It also involved outreach to various of the Pacific Islands, not just in Micronesia, but in elsewhere. And I think a lot of that under Trump is just, they've kind of given up, if you see what I mean. I mean, there's competing in the technological domain, but most of it is now, the strategy is now a much narrower strategy, based on the military domain. And I think your analogy with the Maginot Line is very compelling, actually. And I should almost think I should put that in my book somewhere, because yes, I think the risk is that you, in a sense, you put all of your eggs in this military basket. But what happens if that doesn't work for some reason? As in, either the Chinese find some clever way to go around your Maginot Line. But I think that's exactly the military debate that's going on at the moment. That there is this. The U.S. military has a theory, the Marines in particular, but all of the other services, and this archipelagic defense theory, which is that some combination of new technology, long-range strike, drones, maybe a bit of artificial intelligence in some, will provide an advantage, and that a strategy of kind of forward deployment along the first island chain, as opposed to retreating to the second island chain, is the best strategy. That that is the one that is more likely to deter the Chinese and allow the US to prevail. And that then a lot follows from that, as in and in very concrete terms, it involves having to build missile shields in Guam and build new Air Force bases spread around the second island chain, and doing more with the Marine Corps in northern Philippines and along the Japanese Southwest Islands. And I suppose it's very important, I think, that people in affected nearby regions in Micronesia and elsewhere understand what's going on at a kind of basic level, as in like, why are they doing this? What is the kind of underlying set of ideas that are animating this? And what effect is that going to have, and how does that affect your core interests, and how can you be kind of part of that conversation? And as I say, both, and I think you do this, your institution does this, and you individually do this, of participating in regional forums, trying to create specific forums so that people can understand what's going on. I mean, I think the question of whether this is sustainable in the long run is almost so big that I didn't get into it in the book. But if you think about, there are voices, less so in Japan, but in Australia, for instance, you'd look at somebody like Hugh White as a kind of, he's not within the dominant intellectual community in Australia. He's seen as a bit of a kind of black sheep. But Hugh would be one of those voices who'd basically say, this is sort of pointless, as in the end, we're going to end up in a position where China is the dominant power and the US position is unsustainable. It's a kind of artifact of history, but over time, it's just not going to be possible for the US to hold this position. And therefore, we should kind of admit this and work out, well, how do we get to the next stable equilibrium? And that is a whole other can of worms, as in, that then opens up all sorts of challenges that people in your part of the world might not want to think about, as in one of the obvious consequences of that, which somebody like Bilahari Kausikan, the Singaporean diplomat who's a kind of arch realist, would say is, fine. You can imagine a world in which the United States is no longer the dominant power in the region, but then you also have to imagine a world of nuclear proliferation, as in, that is definitely a world in which Japan and South Korea and probably Australia will end up with nuclear weapons, because if they can't rely on US extended deterrence, they're going to have to do it on their own. And so there are plenty of people in the strategic community who not only think that this is likely, but actually think it might be quite positive that in the end, a world in which China is the dominant power, but you have new balance because you have a proliferation of nuclear weapons, actually might be a better and more stable long-term equilibrium. Now, I mean, I don't want to be glib about this, because these are enormously complicated strategic questions. But in the long term, these are the kind of things that we have to grapple with. We can't just stick our head in the sand and hope that this isn't happening, because the rise of China, the attempt of the United States, as is true. I mean, I don't want to say that the United States is an imperial power, because that's not true. But as is true of imperial powers throughout history, it's very rare for imperial powers to voluntarily dismantle that which they have created. Normally it has to collapse, or it has to be taken from them. And so the process that the United States is going through of, in one form or another, trying to sustain its position in the region, working with its allies and partners, and involving the assets that it has, including on Guam, is part of this. And in a sense, how this plays out is really the dominant story of global geopolitics, which is why I decided that I should try and write a book about it, if you see what I mean. And I'm modest about my own contribution. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I haven't got a clue. I don't, I'm to some degree, particularly under President Trump, I'm more pessimistic about the long-term sustainability of the American position, as it seemed to me that the odds of the Americans being able to hold something like the status quo were much stronger under the strategy that was sort of, laid down by somebody like Kurt Campbell and executed under the Biden administration, where you had a US administration that was much more kind of systematic in its approach. But who knows? But in the end, I think we all have to begin to start contemplating a very different future and trying to work out what our interests are in that and what the consequences of it might be. And obviously, Guam in particular is very much caught in the middle of this. And so I suppose, to get back to the original question, it strikes me that it is very important that the voice of Guam and others within the Marianas and Micronesia are sort of heard in these debates. And although they are going to be small voices amongst, large voices of larger powers, that also that, that people in your community are understanding the nature of these strategic debates, not just within the kind of the US allies and partners, but also in China. And that's a whole other can of worms of trying to understand, ultimately, how do we understand China's actions? And I'm not a sinologist. I don't have Mandarin. I do go to China and I try and speak to Chinese interlocutors. And I try and, in a sense, in the book, I don't want to be seen as a kind of, China bashing China hawk. I want to understand what China is trying to do and how China sees its strategic vulnerabilities and why it is acting in the way that it does. because that's the best way to kind of understand this in the future. So I think, in conclusion, the question that you're asking, Robert, and the kind of analysis that you have is exactly the right one. And it's very, very important that you and others like you continue to invest in asking these questions and doing research and trying to understand the way in which you fit into this wider picture. Because otherwise, I think, there are probably many people in Guam who find all of this slightly bemusing as to why on earth is this happening and why are they behaving in this way, because it seems to be at some level sort of slightly crazy. Anyway, does that make sense?
Well, on that note, thank you so much, James. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I want to end with three things actually. First, let's give James a round of applause again. Number two, for you to be that articulate at 5 a.m. is beyond me. I need to learn that skill. And number three, please, when your book is released, we all look forward to reading it, and we would love to bring you out to the University of Guam to do a book signing and a talk. That would be excellent. We really, really appreciated your time and your contributions today, James. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great day, and I look forward to being back in Guam at some point soon. And as I say, do pop over to London. It's a great place. We'd love to have you. So,
thank you, James. All right. For our listening audience and those of you on Zoom, this actually concludes the Security in Micronesia portion hosted by the Pacific Center for Island Security and the Richard F. Taitano Micronesian Area Research Center. Sijus Masi to all of you who joined us. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And remember, if you don't care about these issues deeply affect you. So we should all start caring about them. Sijus Masi.